All right. Well, hey there. I am Scott King, and that is my co host, Chris Kraus. Hey, Chris.
How's it going?
It's good. Good. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Union Podcast. This one's going to be a little bit different. It's almost a book report, as Chris called it. We're going to talk about the recent McKinsey report that came out. I think this is a couple of weeks ago, Chris.
Yeah.
And I've seen it quite a few times online. The title, and we'll obviously link to all this, is the economic impact or the economic potential of generative AI. So it's not just one model, it's not just one LLM, it's all of them, right? Generative AI. So we took a look at the report, and it's really, really interesting. We're going to walk through some of these findings. Chris, what is there anything that's specifically just like jumped out at you on this? Like what do you really want to get across to people before we, kind of walk through the details that we planned?
Well, other than it's hot, just like it is in Texas, it's like the cool thing is they say there's big things happening and important, but the interesting thing is they actually did some quantification. They qualified out different use cases by industries and gave reasonable statistics and value on them and how it be achieved. So this one doesn't seem like hot air. Someone made something up. It's actually, you can see the research on it. Like when you look at like Exhibit 2 and you look at the actual bar charts, they make sense because they're comparing 2017 versus today and the advancements in generative AI versus in like standard analytics by AI. So what I liked about it is it's actually well written and it's not just fluff. They actually came up with some really good statistics and how the industries should adopt and change.
Yeah, the McKinsey Global Institute, they do compare with that 2017 report. And I would like to be a fly on the wall at some of those meetings when they saw the generative AI and then, someone said, hey, look at our old report. It is completely outdated. We need to redo this because the impact is much, much greater, right? Because we see the use case, right? So we've done a couple of different ChatGPT episodes, like you can't unsee it kind of thing, but you can think about your own job and then maybe the people reporting to you and understand how they can use it. They saw the same thing and they said, okay, this is an extra like 2.6 to 4.6 trillion dollars like per year, not years from now, per year. I can't even quantify 2.6 trillion. They said it's the GDP of the UK, which seems like a big number. What's the GDP of Texas? It's probably a little bit bigger, but understanding the impact, I think, is a good point that you brought out, Chris, because they quantify the use cases, right? So in the report, they talk about, all these different use cases. They got a chart of them on Exhibit 3. And what is this, page 14? 12, page 12. And they list out all these use cases, right? The top portions, Chris, they say are 75% of that impact, which
right.
I want to know how they got to there, right? Because this is sales, marketing, software engineering, customer operations, and then product R&D. What are your thoughts on some of those use cases?
Well, I think the customer operations actually is a little different approach than what people usually think of. We've traditionally thought of, I spend $10 on a phone call with a customer. I spend $15. How do I knock off $1? And so it's always been taking the existing mode, how we do our business today, and changing it just a little bit. But they're saying you're going to get 30 to 4% reduction in costs, but it's by doing it differently. You actually want the generative AI, because it has natural language understanding, to answer the question and solve the case for the person and completely deflect it and not go to the person. So save the complete cost of the call. Don't even go to it at all. And so that's a different mind in motion because, FAQs and chatbots, they promised that, but it never worked because it was just basically, a placeholder to get you frustrated before you talk to a person, right? But in this case, if the generative AI actually can understand your question, and say, prompt you for fill out this form for recall, or this is a specific manual that you're looking for, and these are the instructions in the manual, the details, that's actually a change in that. So that's a big difference that we can actually say, get more done with the same people. And then that would increase our customer satisfaction. But I think it's interesting because they're taking a different approach.
Yeah, I would really want them to realize more of get rid of the call, like you said, to begin with, like especially like a sales related call. So I went to a website from a vendor that we pay money for, and it's a web system. And I was asking this really specific question. I wanted to understand the API rate limits. Like, hey, if we start using your API, what's it going to cost me? And where's all the technical specs, right? And it forces me to talk to a salesperson. So I asked this question. The salesperson clearly didn't know what an API was and didn't know how to help me. So I thought, this is clearly an automated use case, right? All you have to do is understand keywords and entities like API. But he didn't know what it was. So I went out to Google, typed the same exact question, and Google gave it to me. So that's a simple thing, in terms of getting rid of a customer, use case, right? So a sales use case. A salesperson doesn't need to answer that.
Yeah. Well, I think in reality, what we think of is like we've both worked for giant companies and for small companies. And in giant companies, like, oh, you have a question about performance management, you talk to this. APM, talk to this part. Monitoring hardware, talk to this salesperson. Development and test, talk to this person. CRM, talk to this person. So like people tend to be deep specialists in one area, but because computers are faster and computers gotten better, the AI model can be a master of 5 or 6 different functional areas. And so, that guy may only understood of how do you talk about the UI works, not how the APIs on the back end. So that is kind of cool that, yes, the computer or, a bot using natural language understanding, natural language generation is trained across all the disciplines for the company. So they should give you the right answer faster. And so it makes sense because humans they can't memorize everything. You're either a generalist and know a little bit of a lot, or you're a specialist in one area. And so the cool thing is, because software, we can be both.
Yeah, I mean, software is just much faster, right? I mean, memory recall, like you remember everything, but you forget where you put it. Any memory experts could explain how that works, but that's what I remember about it, right? Which is why you're like, oh yeah, forgot about this, and then now I know it because something else reminds you, some tangential piece of information reminds you of that. All right, so customer service and the customer operations, clearly the easiest use case, because we all understand the frustrations of the chatbots, because people ask us all the time, what's the difference between Krista and a chatbot? The chatbot's dumb, right? It doesn't know anything. So marketing and sales, they do go through, that's a high use case. In marketing, my LinkedIn feed is nothing but here's how I use ChatGPT to do this, right? Because it's really good at generating content, generating pictures. That's an easy use case. That's not our target market, right? So we're clearly into, looking at the enterprise IT operations and things like that. They do mention software engineering, Chris, as a big use case. Walk us through some of the use cases and how that would work.
Well, the one thing is, you talk about the fear of adopting technology. So, computer software people using a co-pilot to help you code. So we've had paired programming for years, but the idea is now instead of a second person, you have the computer as a co-pilot helping you. And we had autocomplete years ago in classes and functions. And given it's software engineering people, they like new technology. They like to try new things. So the fear of trying AI to help with this isn't there. And they realize it's not going to take away the job. You still have to give it enough instructions of what to do. So I think that's why that diagram on page 20 calls out all the different areas. And first, there are people who are advanced and want to use new technology. They're not afraid of new technology. So that's why you see traction there. So coding copilots makes sense because Do you want that emotional problem of Scott's looking over my shoulder telling you I'm coding wrong? Or do you just want a co-pilot to make suggestions? You're missing a possible case here. Or in testing, functional testing, low performance testing, it's not easy. We need more of it. We never have enough time. So if software can help us get it done faster, because it's, hey, we've been working on this for 2 weeks. You have 24 hours to do all your job. Of course, you're going to go with it. And I thought it was interesting. They actually took it all the way to maintenance. And that's our use case with Empyrean, right? When you have all these huge log files, you need to look at errors and consolidate them. And you need to then summarize them quickly and draw a conclusion. They actually took it all the way to maintenance, which I think is good. And so to reiterate, it's like that is actually happening now because people like new technology. We're not afraid to try it and use it. So it's a no-brainer it's a good example, right? Because that can be done across other lines of business.
Yeah, and if I was a software engineer, I would really keep all the hallucination case study stories in my back pocket and say, I'm not going to hallucinate. I know how the code works, right? I would definitely do that too. But I mean, like you said, there's been code generation tools forever. That's software runs everything. So it's only going to get better and better and better.
Yep.
Then it did call out research and development. I feel this is probably the furthest from our expertise, but we'll touch on it.
Yeah.
What did they say about R&D?
Well, what's interesting, they went over a lot of the complex algorithms, but what it came down to is that compute is getting faster, like specifically GPU performance and actually the computer threading models to actually perform these activities. And research and development, like in pharmaceutical, is actually getting much faster. So I think they pointed out like these, and they give some very particular complex algorithms they use in that. They've been around a long time, but it took a long time to process. Now the advancements in hardware to complement the AI means they can actually use it. It's fast enough in real time. You can actually get this out of GPU. So I like the fact that they call that multiple use cases, and they weren't reiterating the same point. Each one had a different point. GPUs are getting better. We have processing units for AI. We are assisting people with co-pilots. Content. Looking at multiple things in sales and marketing, drip feeds, all those type of things. I think it was really good. They call out different points, and I think all of them seem tangible and reasonable to me. This is not something I'm going to do in 10 years. This is something I should be doing in the next 10 days.
Yeah, or 10 minutes, right? I mean, you can do this right now. All right, so that outlines the top 75% of the impact, and then they go into, okay, here are the bottom 25%, and I'm going to kind of go like impact is a percent of functional spend. I'm going to go backward, right? So the most impactful, they say, of the smaller ones, procurement, risk and compliance, legal, finance, manufacturing, strategy, and pricing, right? I was really surprised to see risk and compliance here.
Yeah.
Because like maybe they're not really thinking about the impact, because the financial, like maybe it's not a gain, right? It's a risk aversion. So maybe we'll write a complimentary report on the risk aversion gain is actually good for risk and compliance, because that's a complicated thing, right? Measuring all these audits and suppliers, like how many third-party suppliers do large companies have? Thousands, right? How do you manage that? Yeah. What do you think about the risk and compliance?
Well, I think that we would probably disagree with that. Sam's done a podcast with you on it, but I think the trick is the lens that they were looking at this was that I'm going to take a corpus or body of information and train a specific large language model on this to answer these questions. And in this case, things like finance. So when someone says, what were my sales this quarter compared to last quarter? Well, that's not something that you're going to statically train over time. That's where, like on our last podcast series, we talked about you want to use automation to get real-time data. So go into Salesforce and give me the active deals for this quarter, give me the deals that closed last quarter, and then use that to answer my questions. So it's like a lot of these is getting very pertinent real-time data out of your back-end systems. So extracting data and using that. The training of the models is great. It's going to give you language specifics, so we'll know the difference between legal questions and procurement questions. But I think the reason they put these as low is they were thinking about very traditional, I'm going to build a model, I'm going to train a model, and you would have to train it for your company's answers versus, a generic answer. But we talked about the last blog series, right? The last podcast, like you can actually solve this a different way. So I think if you look at this, that different lens, it's like, okay, the large language model is there to understand what I'm talking about, but I have other ways to give it the data so it has the right answers to look for, then these would go up. So I think it's probably true in general, but take a different view on how you want to train the models and get to the data.
Yeah, I'm looking at Exhibit 4. This is on page 25 and specifically, I'm going to look at the risk and legal, and supply chain, right? I think supply chain is risk and legal because I'm thinking third-party risk, right?
Third-party risk.
Software suppliers or maybe, hardware goods suppliers. And I'm just scanning for the, I'm scanning for the dark boxes here.
Yep.
Banking, energy, insurance, real estate, telecommunications. This is all, I'm thinking these people have the most complicated contracts. They have the most end customers, right? Because these are consumer goods, right? So for the risk and legal aspect of the gains could be skewed a little bit, which is why I think, we would like to see the risk and compliance higher on the list because of what we're doing, right? We're not training a model to answer the question. We are using automation to go find the data, then to intelligently prompt the generative AI to produce the question, right? Which is, it sounds the same. It's completely different. Using automation to do it is way easier and way less expensive. If you're interested, that's obviously what we do at Krista. But I think that is interesting. Is it's just low, and I'd like to see it.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So then they go on to the type of work, right? So generative AI is estimated to have the impact on a certain type of work. Chris, what is that?
Well, so they're actually looking at, it's funny, they're saying, back office versus front office. So customer facing, like in a call center, I've got complaints, I've got orders and that. And then they talk about back office things at a bank. But then all of a sudden, the type of things we're talking about are actually customer facing. So it's like, okay, this is actually customer service. It's just for a back end process within the bank itself. And I think that what will happen is there's certain things like having the generative AI make sure you've got all your documents in place before it goes to the loan officer to approve. Like there's certain things you can do. It can scan the documents you give it. Say you emailed in 20 attachments, and it can figure out this is your W-2, this is, a letter of employment, this is all these different things. These are bank accounts and balances. And then it can make a suggestion and then have a human approve it. So there's a lot of things there that the AI can be very assistive. And it would help the professionals with just the nonsense work of you're missing this, I can't do this, you're missing that. And, I think there's a lot that actually can happen in there. And then the thing is, if you train it on your specific model, so your prompt engineering is your specific rules and policies, it won't deviate from those. If you actually say, these, you cannot vary from these policies in the answer, then you actually gave instructions to the model that it has to be black and white based on the policies. So part of it's like just thinking about how you're going to do that in your prompt engineering, like you mentioned.
Yeah. And then, with those different examples and where they sit in different areas of the world, they did touch on the cost of solving the problem is going to be sometimes more expensive than the labor to do it. So the lower wage countries, how we've shifted labor from North America to other places, right? That still could be advantageous to solve it with a human, although you're just kicking the can down the road with that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and like the skill biasing. But so like we mentioned before, yes, the cost center agents are going to be a lower salary person. You probably right short it, so you're in a good cost model there versus an officer at a bank, sitting in a local branch. But the idea is generative AI actually has the opposite pattern. If we can actually train them on the 55 things that the call center agent needs to know, and they're maybe only well skilled in 5 or 10, and it can actually deflect the calls completely, then you get a lot of value there. And then really, if you take care of the nonsense and let the skilled people actually work on decisions, like making sure they have all their documents, they've validated the documents they've submitted, then that actually is a game changer, right? So more educated people can focus on using brain power to do educated things versus, okay, let me make sure they got all the forms filled out and I have all the forms I need to process this. So it does help some with the tasking stuff, but that gets that off the hands of people you want to be focused on thinking and decisioning.
Yeah, because that's the high value, right? I mean, anybody that receives a request from outside of the company or a peer, like, hey, can you do this for me, right? It's like, well,
Yeah.
I'm really working on this thing, right? That's really important, and this isn't, right? Everybody has that list. So if you could get rid of the where is this? How can I find? Can you help? Because that's what happens. I mean, that's what happens to you all the time, right? So, Chris,
Yeah.
you're the smartest guy here. How does this work, right? Which is why you're on the podcast, by the way.
Yeah.
And so if you could get rid of all of those tasks, like you said, that 50% of stuff that just someone just doesn't understand or they can't find it, then doing that is an enormous value. And that's more where the report goes into the white collar, the high knowledge workers to remove those type of tasks. So completely agree. So Chris, I think we're going to I think that's what we wanted to discuss. I want to get to the last exhibit that I want to talk about is Exhibit 6, and to me, this is the biggest takeaway. And this goes from when McKinsey did the report from 2017 into 2023. They said, hey, as a result of the generative AI, we're completely re-estimating what we thought, right? Because the natural language understanding technology has just leapfrogged over everything else. And they list all of these capabilities, coordination with multiple agents, creativity, reasoning, natural language generation, which is what we're talking about today, understanding, output articulation, sensory perception. So the biggest takeaway is they said the human median capability for this technology was going to come out in 2027, which means 4 years from now, the technology would be half as good as a human doing those things. Now they're saying that's today, right? So that's a 4-year difference. That's a big deal. How do you think people are going to perceive that, and what should they do?
Well, I think some people will be laggards and be like, it's hype, I don't believe it. But this paper does a really good job of describing that. They lay that out, and they actually describe practical use cases where it's being done. So it's going to be working with people saying, there's what you see, and people are very interested in ChatGPT. They hear that on the news, and then they kind of got scared. Well, what about hallucinations and all these problems? So there's that middle ground of, okay, how can we actually operationalize this? And we are still getting questions on that. Like one of our big partners, they said they queried customers for use cases. I thought they'd get 10. They literally came up with 100 use cases they could put dollar value behind. So we've upped our expectations, and the fact that the technology has advanced to where it is in 2023 means that you've got to start doing it now. If not, your competitors are going to do it, and you can be left behind. So this is no longer a wait and see what happens, because it is 2027 is shifted left to 2023. So that's cool. Yeah. So I think it's a big mind shift, and budgets will probably be shifting for 2024 on actually saying we have to do this. We've started dabbling now, and we need to operationalize this big time across the organization.
Yeah, definitely. People are going to shift budgets 2024 budgets, because they're playing with it now. They're doing pilots. This stuff really works. It's really attainable. It's really valuable, and it's not as difficult as people are making it, because I think they're doing it the wrong way. And so with our previous episodes, Chris, that we just finished on our generative AI integration, methods, right? We did how fast you can actually do it, governing your data, and then you really need automation to do the next steps of the generative AI. So we'll link back to that. So Chris, any closing thoughts before we let everybody go?
Yeah, I'm good. I mean, I was thinking the power might go out of my house again, but we're good. We made it.
All right. Well, I really appreciate it, Chris, and thanks everybody. Until next time.
Cheers.